All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. I'm Scott Horton. It's Anti-War Radio. And, oh, man, I can't get a hold of David Enders. Oh, wait, here he is in the email. Standing by, he says. Try it this way. Oh, I didn't get it that he's out of the country. Well, hell. How about this? All right, it worked. It's hard to reach a guy in Iraq when you're calling his American cell phone number or something. I was calling the wrong one. My bad. All right, well, good. Dave.
Oh, you were calling, okay.
Well, there you go. It happens. Live radio, no problem. Hey, so you're in Iraq right now? Is that correct?
Yeah. I thought that's why you were calling.
Oh, well, actually, I was calling about the time you spent in Libya, but let's go ahead and start there if you want to.
Oh, no kidding. Okay, all right. We can do that, too.
Well, you're a hell of a reporter, man. You're going to all these wars and writing all these things about them. Let's start with Iraq. Well, what's your most important story coming out of Iraq today?
The situation in Iraq at the moment is that the Americans appear to be indeed withdrawing combat troops. I think that's a fact. It does not appear that there is any way the Iraqi government will approve a presence of combat troops following the end of the year. Obviously, there will still be a military presence and a CIA presence. I mean, the Americans are still very much involved in counterterrorism on the ground here, and that will probably continue to be the case. We'll also be heavily involved in training and supporting the Iraqi military, which has essentially, become a client of the U.S. The situation on the ground, I think, for the average Iraqi has changed very little. The government still remains essentially a dictatorship. Iraq still is a police state. I was arrested this afternoon, or this morning rather, for filming on the highway. I was actually filming a convoy of Americans sort of, packing up to go. And I got arrested for filming on the highway. I was detained for a few hours, nothing serious, and let go. But that gives you an idea of the amount of personal freedom one perhaps has in Iraq. Electricity is still on 12 hours a day at best. Right now, it's October. This is a time where electricity demand is probably the lowest. It's before it gets cold and people turn on their heaters. It's after the, super hot summer months, so people aren't running the ACs quite as much. And I'm living a stone's throw from the presidential compound, and this neighborhood has 12 hours of national power a day. So I think that gives an idea of how the quality of life has improved for the average Iraqi. Security is much better than it was. I haven't been here since 2009. But that comes with a soldier to person ratio that must be one of the highest in the world. I mean, the number of checkpoints, the number of the security presence on the streets is just kind of incredible. And that does still not mean that there's not violence. But, compared to 2007, 2008, it's considerably reduced. So that's the situation in Iraq as we near the official date of withdrawal.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, the Status of Forces Agreement stipulates, of course, that December 31st is the last day for combat forces. And you said the combat forces are packing up and going, but they're leaving. And let's put aside Hillary Clinton's private army here for a minute and stick with these counterterrorism forces that you mentioned. Also, I'd like to edge in a question here about American air power and airplanes sold to them that almost certainly, I would think, would require the American Air Force to build them airports or help them in air traffic control and training in every way and all these kinds of things. I'm trying to get my head around exactly how big of a loophole in the Status of Forces Agreement are we dealing with here. And, I mean, like counterterrorism forces, that means combat troops, doesn't it? Infantry, right?
No. Not necessarily. That means advisors. That means people in support of. And there is, my impression is, and I haven't done all of this reporting. I've been focused on some other things as well, because I think it's kind of a foregone conclusion we're going to be supporting them very heavily in this sense. So it does mean people advising. That does not necessarily mean leading operations. I don't think that rules out helping them plan operations. My understanding is we are still very heavily involved, and probably will be very heavily involved in intelligence gathering. I mean, it doesn't seem to me much different than the kind of support we provide for a lot of client states. We are going to be here helping them do all sorts of things. American air power. Well, Iraq is in the process of buying F-18s, so I think that gives you a pretty solid idea of how this is happening. They are being set up to do their own air power with our assistance.
And now about that State Department presence, is that just the big loophole? We don't need bases because we have the biggest embassy ever and a private army of thousands?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on how you're looking at it. I think the Iraqi army is at a point where it can hold its own on the ground. I don't think the status of forces. I mean, the status of forces agreement, the withdrawal. We're talking about combat troops, boots on the ground, guys doing patrols, guys securing areas. I mean, if you look at, say Yemen, right, where we're doing airstrikes there, with government support and approval. I don't see how the situation in Iraq is necessarily going to be different than that, or different than, Egypt, where we rendition people and have for a long time. I think that kind of coordination is certainly going to be present.
So really, would it be right then that it's sort of an illusion that they were pushing for bases and tens of thousands of troops? That really, this is pretty much what they wanted in the end, anyway. The Pentagon, I mean.
That's a good question.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm going to save your answer until we get back from this break, David. Hang it right there. It's David Anders from McClatchy Newspapers, everybody. We'll be right back. All right, y'all, welcome back. It's Anti-War Radio. Scott Horton, I'm talking with David Anders. He's an independent journalist, been writing for McClatchy Newspapers, and I'm sorry I don't have a full bio in front of me. I have the page open here somewhere. David, where else are you writing these days?
Well, at the moment, always doing stuff for Free Speech Radio News on Pacifica. There'll be some stuff on McClatchy from Iraq, or there should be later this week. And... wow, what else have I got lined up on this trip? Sorry, I can't even keep track. Whoever's paying is how it works these days. Pick up my book, Baghdad Bulletin, from the University of Michigan.
Oh, there you go. Baghdad Bulletin. Great. All right, now, so when we went out to the break, I was asking you about this relationship between America and the American government and the Iraqi government here. And what I was trying to get at was how, they've refused to authorize the stationing of tens of thousands of troops there. And there's a lot of posturing by the Americans that that's what they wanted. But then on the other hand, apparently they're willing to have a huge number of private contractors and special forces trainers and a long-term relationship with the Air Force and all these other things, which makes me wonder whether they're, standing up to the Americans and refusing anything at all, or whether this is really what they were after in the end was, what basically the status quo, or what it looks like we're going to have now, is basically what both sides wanted anyway.
Well, I think it's hard to say. I mean, if you go back to 2005, it's quite. I don't think it's unfair to say that that's probably what the architects of all of this had in mind, or rather back to 2002, 2003. I think probably there was an idea of an imposing American military force and bases in Iraq, and Iraq is a extremely strategic location for U.S. forces, and but the reality of the occupation has been that the presence has greatly alienated Iraqis in many, many ways, and that's why Iraqi lawmakers essentially couldn't keep their jobs if they were to allow a huge presence of U.S. combat forces on the ground. And I think also the reality of the amount of money we've spent here and what it's done to our military is probably setting in as well. As far as American strategy, it's, hard to say exactly, as we rarely articulate it in the way that, in what is the reality. I guess when you look at it, if this has been a success, then what you can say is that what's changed since 2003 is that Iraq is once again a client state. It's essentially a free market kleptocracy, and the U.S. has access to oil here, and at least a nominal ally in some ways. So perhaps that was the goal. And I don't think it's unfair to say that was certainly what George Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz were hoping for. I think there were a lot of different motivations for the war, but I think the main one was definitely economic and oil related. And I think when you look at what we've done for the average Iraqi in 8 years, it's hard to dispute that. There's been, the U.S. military and the State Department have done jack all for the millions of refugees that are in this country. The infrastructure is still in terrible, terrible shape. The country has a government that is extremely, extremely corrupt. Second, perhaps to Afghanistan, which, we're also occupying. So it's hard to say exactly whether this was the end goal or whether there were different, I think there were different versions or different scenarios for the end goal, but I think this is in some ways an acceptable outcome for American foreign policy, if you accept the idea that America's foreign policy, when we say interests, we mean economics.
Yeah, or at least the economics of state power anyway. But yeah, I should have been more clear. I was thinking, post-surge policy. What were they really trying to accomplish? I saw a blog called The Common Ills, writes about Iraq quite a bit, and they basically were writing that they thought it was a red herring that, like Patrick Coburn reported back in 2008, that they were pushing for 56 permanent bases and all that, as though it was still 2003. That they knew they weren't getting that, but they didn't care because they're still getting their biggest embassy in the history of the world, that one country's ever had in another, and they're still going to have this air power relationship, et cetera. And I guess, that sounds pretty much right to me. And they're talking, post-surge strategy, post-Petraeus, going over there and redefining what winning means. But, I have to wonder, too, David, how much influence they've really bought with all this blood and all this money. In the Washington Post this morning, they're horrified. No, it's October 8th. Iraq, siding with Iran, sends essential aid to Syria's Assad. And they just can't believe how little influence they seem to have in Baghdad when it comes to issues like Iraqi foreign policy.
Well, that's perhaps naive. The thing, I guess when you look at how many people have died here, and the damage that has been done to an already damaged country, and Iraqis don't see for Iraqis, the American war with Iraq does not begin in 2003, it begins in 1991. Iraqis have essentially endured 2 decades of war with the U.S., and America doesn't really acknowledge that. So you have a group of people who are quite happy to see us go, who don't really want us here in many, many ways. And as I said before, it puts their politicians in an awkward position because they can't do it. We've seen in the last 2 Iraqi elections, Muqtada al-Sadr has become the power broker, and he is vehemently anti-American and opposed to the presence of U.S. forces, first militarily and certainly now politically, and he's continued to threaten military action if the U.S. were to stay. Iraq being close to the Iranian government is a natural thing. I mean, the countries are geography. The countries are right next to each other. Certainly the people in power in Iraq have a lot in common with the people in power in Iran. They are Shiite Muslims who essentially have many of the same religious leaders and share many of the same ideas about the role of religion in government. And Iran is a major backer of Syria. Now, that does not necessarily mean that Iraq will always side with Iran. There are definite differences between Iraq and Iran, but for the moment, it's not at all surprising that Iraq is not criticizing Syria. You also have to look at the fact that there are 1 million refugees due in part to our occupation in Syria from Iraq. And those people have not started coming back in huge numbers. Even with all of the unrest in Syria, they currently remain in Syria. So you have them as potential political pawns or political footballs, and the implications that has. Many of them are afraid to go back because of violence. Many of them are, exiled because of our occupation. And so it's not at all surprising that the Iraqi government is tiptoeing around the issue in Syria and probably doesn't want to get involved, A, for alienating the Iranian government to some extent, B, for potential retaliation against Iraqi citizens in Syria.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, I'm sorry, we'll have to leave it there. Maybe I'll try to get you back on in a day or two to talk about Libya. Would that be all right?
That'd be great.
Okay, everybody, that's David Enders. Read his book, Baghdad Bulletin, and also read him at McClatchydc.com.